20 years ago, precisely on the 9th of November, when the Berlin Wall collapsed. Berlin Wall, which was the symbol of the Cold War division of Europe. Then Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, declared that Hungary removed the first brick from the Berlin Wall when it opened its border with Austria for more than 60,000 East German refugees. Refugees who came to Hungary as tourists, I will come back to it later, who came to Hungary as tourists, but as they didn't want to return to the DDR, to East Germany, then they became refugees legally, and we let them go. That was on the 11th of September 1989, and 2 months later the Berlin Wall collapsed. The question which I'm rather frequently put to, and which I would like to answer today, that how a country, that Soviet bloc country, Hungary, could contribute to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and even the reunification of Germany. Because Hungary at that time was a member of the Warsaw Pact, the opposite bloc to NATO, and a member of the Comecon, and opposite to the European, at that time called European Economic Communities or European Communities. The question is, what motivated the leaders of Hungary, which was a one-party, single-party state belonging to the Soviet bloc, what motivated the Hungarian leaders to take side with the Federal Republic of Germany in its conflict with East Germany, the DDR? The answer is in the long process of step-by-step changes, which made Hungary more and more different from the other Soviet bloc countries. The first step was rather radical and even dramatic. That was the Hungarian Revolution in October 1956. You certainly have heard a lot about it. This revolution, which was brutally crushed by the Soviet Red Army after 12 days, but it reflected the strong desire of the Hungarian people to get rid of the Soviet rule, and also the strong desire of the Hungarian people for freedom and democracy. The revolution had been crushed, but its spirit has survived. 12 years later, in 1968, Hungary introduced some economic reforms, some market elements in the Soviet-style command economy. That was the second step after 56, the revolution. This economic reform was soon followed by more liberal cultural policy and relatively more freedom and democracy under the circumstances of the Soviet-style one-party system. By the late 70s, Hungary was widely called the happiest barrack of the Soviet bloc. But the general understanding inside and outside Hungary was that the price of the more freedom was 100% loyalty to the Soviet foreign policy, 100% loyalty, 100% support for the global aspirations of the Kremlin. However, in the early 80s, we recognized, when I say we, I mean those people who were in some commanding position of Hungarian foreign policy. At that time, I was the deputy head of the international department of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, which was de jure a communist party. De facto, it was getting more and more social democratic party than communist. We had very close relationship with most of the Western social democratic parties, including SPD Germany. At that time, the president of this party was Willy Brandt, and all the other parties in Western Europe. So, this 100% loyalty to the Kremlin foreign policy aspirations started to change. Because in the early 80s, we recognized that there was a window of opportunity provided by the leadership vacuum in the Kremlin. You may remember it from the books that between 82 and 85, the Soviet Union was ruled by 3 aging Secretary Generals of the Soviet Communist Party. The first one was Leonid Brezhnev, who passed away at the end of 82. Another man came, even older and more sick than Brezhnev. He passed away, he was Andropov, and passed away after 1 year. Then came the third one, who was the oldest of the 3, Chernenko, who passed away in the spring of 1985. But between 82 and 85, we had a kind of vacuum, because apparently the Kremlin leaders focused much more on the succession issue. Who will come next? When Brezhnev passed, who will follow Brezhnev? When Andropov passed away, who will follow Andropov? Who will be the next Secretary General, the number 1 in the Soviet hierarchy? Who will be the next one? So they were focusing apparently on the succession and not on the Hungarian foreign policy. So we recognized it, and we recognized that it provides an extra room of maneuvering for us. We didn't know how long this period will last, but anyhow, we recognized that we have to make use of it. And we tried and managed to make the maximum use of this power shift vacuum, this window of opportunity, this relatively broader room of maneuver. In 1982, we established informal relations with the then European Economic Community. There was a German Social Democratic Commissioner called Haferkamp, with whom we established some informal connections. We did some reform-minded people in the Hungarian party. We were helped to get access to Haferkamp by one of the chief policy advisors of then Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, another elderly statesman called Eugen Zeltman, who helped us to get into contact with Commissioner Haferkamp. And we started these informal talks, which later grew into some informal, later formal talks. Talks on trade relations between Hungary, member of Comecon, and the European Economic Community, on industrial cooperation, and on the longer term, even on diplomatic relations. You should know that at that time, Comecon, led by the Soviet Union, simply didn't recognize the European Economic Community. And then one member of Comecon started to talk about even diplomatic relations. So we really went up to the wall of the room of maneuvering which we had. Also in 1982, Hungary joined the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. For some years, it already had been a desire of the reform wing in the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, supported by economic experts who believed that we needed this support from the IMF and the World Bank. But the problem is that accession was very strongly opposed by Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union. Whenever he met the Hungarian leader, János Kádár, Brezhnev always warned the Hungarians not to join the IMF, not to join the World Bank, because they are the tools of US imperialism, as he put it. So we were, from time to time, again discouraged to establish official contact. But at the end of 82, some weeks before Brezhnev passed away, we officially joined these two organizations. It was a step which certainly went beyond the activities of all the other Soviet countries. No one had the guts to do it. In the autumn of 1983, next year, the wind of Cold War started to blow again in Europe. because the Soviets broke the Geneva talks with the United States on nuclear missiles, and the then Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko declared that there was no room for any East-West dialogue because the Western NATO countries started to deploy the US cruise and Pershing II missiles. However, next year, spring next year, 1984, Hungary made successful efforts to maintain the East-West dialogue, as Hungary received the official visits of Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, Bettino Craxi of Italy, Helmut Kohl of Germany, and even Wilfried Martens of Belgium. The leaders of those 4 NATO countries that had started to deploy the Pershing II and the cruise missiles in accordance with the so-called dual threat decision of NATO, what made the Soviets furious. In 1985, after these 4 successful visits, even Margaret Thatcher, I remember, declared when next year she visited Moscow that hadn't she go to Hungary 1 year before, she couldn't go to Moscow. So Hungary, the visit to Hungary was a kind of overture to her visit to Moscow a year later. In 1985, this lame duck period in the Kremlin came to its end because a new and energetic leader came to power, that was Mikhail Gorbachev. But as he was much more open-minded and much more flexible than any of his predecessors, the room of maneuvering for Hungary and Hungarian foreign policy remained broad, and we could continue. Next year, in 1986, at that time I was already deputy foreign minister, so I went from the party to the state apparatus, and I was deputy foreign minister in 1986. We started to further intensify our bilateral relations with the Western democracies and maintained regular exchanges. Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, King Juan Carlos of Spain, Queen Margaret of Denmark, all came to Hungary. It was the only Soviet bloc country where kings and queens came and paid official visits. And also Richard von Weizsäcker, at that time the federal president of Germany, visited Hungary, and a number of prime ministers, and these visits were ended by the visit in the summer of 1989, George Bush to Syria, at that time the president of the United States. So while other Soviet bloc countries were competing with each other, who had the worst relations with the US, then we had the best one, and we were quite unique in the Soviet bloc. Also, the Prime Minister of Hungary visited a number of Western countries, Austria, Finland, France, Greece, Spain, US and Canada. And we signed an agreement with the European communities. That was the outcome of the talks we started in 1982. We finally signed the agreement in Brussels with the European communities on trade relations, abolishing the quantitative restrictions in bilateral trade, on industrial cooperation, and even on diplomatic relations. We also re-established diplomatic relations with the Vatican and with Israel. With Vatican, we broke diplomatic relations in the early 50s, late 40s or early 50s, under the pressure of the Soviet Union. And we did the same, we broke diplomatic relations with Israel after the 6 Days War in 1967. All the Soviet bloc countries had to break diplomatic relations with Israel. That was the request, I would say, order of the Kremlin. But we re-established these two relations in 1986-87. We also established newly diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea, South Korea. You could imagine the hysteric reaction of North Korea. And also established diplomatic relations with the Republic of South Africa. none of the Soviet bloc countries had the guts to follow the example of Hungary, so we were completely unique in this diplomacy. Then Hungary, the Hungarian government made 3 more important decisions that were these decisions in full harmony with our open foreign policy. The first was a new passport regulation. You should know that in the Soviet bloc countries, citizens didn't have a passport valid for all the 5 continents. Most of them had a passport with a very limited scope, only valid for the other Soviet bloc countries. That was, for instance, the rule in the DDR, that they had passports only valid for the Soviet bloc countries, but not for Austria, and certainly not for the Federal Republic of Germany, because the Berlin Wall would have lost its significance in that case. So the first important decision of Hungary was to introduce a new Western-type passport regulation. All Hungarian citizens got passport valid for all the 5 continents without any exit visa, which is also a special thing in the Soviet bloc country, that even if you had a valid passport, you had to seek for an exit permit to use your passport. And you may get or may not get this exit visa, this exit permit. So the new passport regulation, another change in Hungary. Then we joined the Geneva Convention on Refugees, which strictly forbids to refuse any political refugees and to extradite any political refugees. We joined the Geneva Convention in 1989, the spring of 1989. And finally, we decided the ill-famed Iron Curtain. Part of the Iron Curtain was the Hungarian-Austrian border. It was actually a barbed wire and an electric alarm system, that if somebody wanted to cross the border without a passport, then it gave an alarm signal and the border guard could go and catch him or her. But the removal of the Iron Curtain in May and June of 1989 was really a sensation. A photograph on which the 2 foreign ministers, Gyula Horn of Hungary and Alois Mock of Austria, cut the Iron Curtain, was on the front page all over the world. And this photograph and the news that Hungary removed the Iron Curtain encouraged East German citizens to come to Hungary as tourists. You should know that there was a tradition for many years then, that East Germans came to Hungary to go to the Lake Balaton and to meet their relatives who came from the Federal Republic, from Western Germany, because Hungary was the place where the West Germans could come very easily, without any difficulties, even without a visa, and even East Germans could come because they had a passport for Hungary as one of the Soviet bloc countries. So it was not particular that East Germans came, but after the opening of the barbed wire, after removing the Iron Curtain, tens of thousands came, much more than before. And then when in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at that time I was already the number 2, I was State Secretary, the first deputy to the minister. In the Foreign Ministry, then we realized that tens of thousands of East German tourists came and learned that they didn't want to return to the DDR. So they became refugees. It was evident that we had to let them go. One day we had to let them go, and informally in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs we drew this conclusion as early as in July 1989. Because it was evident for us that forcing them back to the DDR, to the Honecker regime, would have been antagonistic to the long process of opening, which I tried to summarize, and would certainly undermine the credibility of Hungarian foreign policy. The question was only when and how to open the border. When and how to let them go to Austria and via Austria to the Federal Republic of Germany. Finally, first we tested the Soviets. Whenever I met, as the number 2 in the Foreign Ministry of Hungary, whenever I met high-ranking Soviet diplomats, my opposite number and other high-ranking Soviet diplomats, I always made use of the opportunity to explain them that we Hungarians are in a very difficult situation. We have tens of thousands of East German families coming with children, living, staying in tents around the embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany. And we encourage the 2 German states to come to some solution, but they are apparently not able to come to an agreement. So one day, we Hungarians should find a solution. And I was carefully listening to the answer to the question. Whenever I raised it, the answer was all the same. It is the business of the 2 German states and you, Hungarians. The Soviet Union will not interfere. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. And I did consider it as a green light that we can start planning the operation and one day we can open the border. So we found and elaborated a legally fair solution. That was our idea, to have a legally fair solution. We suspended the application of the Hungarian East German bilateral agreement on bilateral tourism. We suspended it because it stipulated that none of the 2 countries could let the citizens of the other to cross the border and to go to a third country for which they do not have valid travel documents. At that time, in 1989, having in mind the new passport regulation, it was a unilateral commitment, a unilateral obligation for Hungary only. Because whenever a Hungarian tourist came to Berlin, then he could pass to West Berlin because he had a valid travel document, a passport valid for all the 5 continents. While the citizens couldn't have this possibility in Hungary. They couldn't go to Austria because they didn't have a valid travel document, a valid passport for Austria. So that made the situation very different from the time of the late 60s when we signed this agreement. And we referred to the Vienna Convention on bilateral treaties and referred to the change of the circumstances, and we suspended the application of these points in the treaty and decided to let these 60,000 East Germans go. And 1 year later, we could witness the reunification of Germany, the unification of the 2 German states, and it paved the way to the unification of Europe, even to the Big Bang enlargement. Much later, in the year of 2004 and 2007, the Big Bang enlargement of the European integration, which resulted in a community of 27 member states. And this Big Bang enlargement, and that made it very much different from previous rounds of enlargement, like when the 3 EFTA countries, Austria, Finland and Sweden joined. It was different because it went beyond the Yalta world order, because it involved some former Soviet bloc countries. Of course, other conditions were also needed to put an end to the half-a-century-long Cold War division in Europe. First, the meeting of George Bush the Senior, President of the US, and President Gorbachev in Malta, which abolished the Yalta World Order. At that time, December 1989, Gorbachev made clear to Bush that he would let the countries belonging to the Soviet bloc, to the Soviet Empire, go. Because Gorbachev apparently understood that the Soviet Union cannot afford anymore to maintain such a huge empire. It would be too costly for the Soviets. And also, another important event, the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact, disintegration of the Comecon, and the disintegration, finally, of the Soviet Union put an end to the bipolar world. And last but not least, the transition of the former Soviet bloc countries, including Hungary, from the one-party system to multi-party parliamentary democracy in 1989, 1990, 1991, and the transition from the command economy to the free enterprise to market economy. These were the necessary conditions to put an end to the Cold War division of Europe and to the enlargement of the European integration. So at the beginning, I told you that Hungary, a Soviet bloc country, took side with the Federal Republic of Germany in its conflict with the DDR, with East Germany. But I can conclude that Hungary, when it took side with the Federal Republic of Germany, also took side in another conflict. In the conflict of the citizens, of the freedom-loving citizens of DDR and the Honecker regime, which was more Muscovite than the Kremlin itself at that time. And in this conflict, we took side with the citizens of the DDR, we took side with the values of freedom and democracy. And I think that was the answer to the question why the Hungarian leaders, why the leaders of a Soviet bloc country took side with the Federal Republic of Germany in its conflict with the DDR. To conclude, I want to tell you that Europe now is very close to be united, but it is not yet united. The European Union has got 27 member states. It is the #1 economic power in the world. The GDP is a bit higher than that of the United States. It is the #1 player in international trade. It is the #1 donor to the developing countries. And it is playing a leading role in tackling the global challenges like climate change, for instance, which is a very timely issue now. But the dream, what I have, and I think all of you shares, a Europe without walls, which is the slogan of this event. A Europe without walls, I could add, a Europe without any curtains, not even without iron curtain, but even a velvet or silk curtain. Any division in Europe is not yet here, because we still have some differences between the old and the new member states. Being a European Commissioner, and having been a European Commissioner for 5 years now, which is coming to the end of my mandate, I still feel some differences between the old and the new member states, and I try to do my best, and I hope I contributed to the real unification to put an end to this kind of division. My dream is a Europe which is united in diversity. My dream is a Europe which is truly democratic in the sense that it gives no room for extremist views and extremist tendencies, which gives no room for hatred, for anti-Semitism or xenophobia. My dream is a Europe which maintains its tradition, but which is innovative at the same time. My dream is a Europe which is competitive, but not at the expense of social and environmental spendings. My dream is a Europe where solidarity prevails inside the member states, between the member states, and between Europe and the rest of the world. And my dream is a Europe which is able to tackle the global challenges. I mentioned one, the climate change, but I could mention a number of others. And my last sentence is that if we want to have this kind of Europe, this really united Europe, then we have to give preferences, we have to give priority to the community interest over national egoism. Thank you very much for your attention.